Harrison from Vininspo, and I wish you a warm welcome to this alternative format edition of the podcast. My guest for this episode is Guillaume Michel. Guillaume is the 6th generation vigneron at Domaine Louis Michel, which has been growing grapes in the heart of Chablis since 1850. As the name suggests, this alt format series differs from the regular podcast, and this one is intended as a video. I seriously recommend you watch it to get the full value from the content. First, what is this alt format business? Well, the raison d'etre of the usual conversations is to be universally relatable and, I hope, engaging and easy to follow for anyone with the slightest interest in wine, food and travel. This series offers a chance to delve into more specific matters, a bit more winey and educational I suppose, but I hope still accessible, enlightening and thought-provoking. As I said, my conversation with Guillaume was recorded as a video. He has excellent English, but the video has subtitles in case any unfamiliar terms crop up, especially when it comes to vineyard sites. Plus, there are lots of maps and images to add visual context to Guillaume's explanations. If you're not already doing so, you can watch it on Substack, and it's designed to give you a really solid sense of what Chablis is all about, from general to specific, traditional to contemporary, vine to glass. I'd love to hear what you think of it, both what it contains and how it's presented, and beg you to like, comment and share if you find any value in it. Anyway, let's not keep Guillaume waiting. I started by asking him where in the world this fabled Chardonnay grows.
All right, so Chablis is the northernmost vineyards in Burgundy. We are roughly 120 kilometers north of Beaune. So you can imagine that we have different microclimates, we have a different soil. And so that makes Chablis quite unique actually in Burgundy. So first of all, I would say on the main characteristic of Chablis, there is the latitude and the climate. So our climate is a continental climate, meaning quite a long, slow ripening that will preserve the natural acidity. We harvest in September. We used to harvest in October, let's say 30 years ago. So you can feel that climate change has an effect on the harvest and the winemaking process. But this quite late harvest compared to the rest of Burgundy retains freshness. So that's for the climate. The soil in Chablis, so Chablis, it's famous for its very unique soil that we call the Kimmeridgian limestone. So it helps for the water draining. It's a mineral-rich soil. It is not too stressful for the vines. It helps to concentrate the flavor. And of course, it provides this very distinctive saline, flinty, character that we can have that make the characteristic of the wine of Chablis.
Yeah, lots of people grow up with the idea of the Portlandien limestone or marls and Kimmeridgian. How do you, in terms of the soil structure, but also the distribution of those soils, how do you describe those? And potentially where that idea that one is associated with the higher rated vineyards than the other?
So, yeah, right. We have two types of soil in Chablis, Kimmeridgian and Portlandian. So historically, the Kimmeridgian is the main one, So Kimmeridgian goes back to 150 million years ago, where here in Chablis, it was recovered by the ocean. Now we still have in our soils all the sediments of fossils of seashells. So now the Kimmeridgian, it's layers of marls and limestone, quite dense, with all of marine fossils, and especially the Exogyra virgula, which is a tiny oyster, main characteristic of the soil of Chablis, of the Kimmeridgian soil. And this is really what I would call the historical terroir of Chablis. All the Grand Cru are on Kimmeridgian soil, as well as the majority of Chablis that are located in the historical part. The other soil is the Portlandian, slightly younger. So it's maybe, I don't remember exactly, but it's maybe just 120 million years. Upper Jurassic, what we call. It's harder and pure limestone, less marls, less fossils. And that kind of soil, you can find it more on the plateau above the hills, mainly the Petit Chablis plateau and some Chablis village, especially the Chablis that were added to the appellation back in the 70s, 80s, during which the appellation of Chablis was quite extended. Yeah, so that's the two soils that we have. So the geology is very distinctive. So of course you can imagine that it produces two different styles of wines. But to resume, I would say that Premier and Grand Cru and majority of Chablis are on Kimmeridgian soil. And while the majority of Petit Chablis, all the new terroir of Chablis recently planted are more on the Portlandian soil.
Excellent. And look, when it comes to Burgundy, I suppose, especially, people are quite familiar with the idea of the slopes of the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit, the way that they face and the way that the vineyard hierarchy, I suppose, is associated with pretty much a consistent slope band. Whereas Chablis is a different shape. How do you explain the hillsides, the valleys, the distribution of vineyards in Chablis?
So the characteristic of Chablis is that you have the village of Chablis right in the middle and surrounded by vineyards all around. And the topography is quite particular because we have a lot of small valleys and hillsides with different exposure. You can imagine a bit like a star. You have the village in the middle and a lot of valleys going in all directions. So of course you have the main valley, of course, which is the river Serein that created this main valley. But around it, you have quite a lot of. So you can imagine that each valley will have its own terroir characteristic, different soil, different exposure, different microclimates, and that will make the richness of the diversity, I would say, maybe on all those terroir expression. That is to me very interesting, and that shows this diversity that we have in Chablis. So the river separates two big banks, the right bank and the left bank, which is quite the main separation here. On the right bank, you will have all the Grand Cru. The other characteristic is that all the Grand Cru are all located on the same area, quite small, a bit more than 100 hectares total, because Chablis total is 5,000 hectares, so on which you can have only a bit more than 100 hectares of Grand Cru and only, I think it's 700 hectares of Premier Cru. So Premier Cru and Grand Cru represents 16-70% of the overall production only. And so you will find the Petit Chablis more on the plateau, as we said earlier, the plateau that are more Portlandian. And yes, that will be the main, the global characteristic here.
Okay, and so that leaves us with quite a large and varied distribution of Premier Cru vineyards.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a strong feeling about which parts of the Premier Cru land are of the highest quality, or do you feel that they are distributed very widely across that Premier Cru area and that the differences are not so much about quality but more character in the Premier Cru?
Totally. I agree. The difference, we talk about more different character. Talking about different quality in the Premier Cru, it's difficult because we are talking about higher quality wine overall. But it's what's very interesting. You know, we have 40 different Premier Cru in Chablis, in Lieu-dit. Quite a lot. They are consolidated over about 15, 17 main names. Because otherwise it would be a bit too confusing for a customer. But it gives you an idea of the richness of diversity that we have in the Premier Cru. And Premier Cru, you can find it both on the right bank and on the left bank. In a lot of people's mind, it's interesting to see that people will think that the right bank Premier Cru are more qualitative than the left bank Premier Cru. To me, it's a big mistake. I'm not talking about higher quality. I'm talking more of different style on the right bank. They are more powerful and rich. But I don't like to talk about a lower quality on the left bank because the left bank shows Premier Cru that are very interesting, especially nowadays, because to me, on the left bank, there will be maybe more diversity that we can have on the right bank in all the different Premier Cru. And maybe more finesse and more minerality, while the right bank produces the Premier Cru that have more maybe power and generosity. But it's not a quality difference to me. It's more diversity. Talking about altitude, the altitude difference in Chablis is not very high, you know. The village of Chablis is located at 150 meters above sea level, so not very high. But I would say that the highest hill around the village of Chablis, where you can find the top of the Buteau, for example, on the left bank, will be around 200, 250 meters. So not very high difference of altitude.
Yeah, okay. So you have, for example, you have Vaux-Laurent, which is within the flag-bearing Premier Cru of Fourchaume.
Exactly.
And Séché, which is within the flag-bearing Premier Cru of Vaillant. So theoretically, they could both be labelled with the other name.
Yes.
Do you feel that those wines, Séché and Vaux-Laurent, for you, would be typical examples of those flag-bearing premier cru, i.e. if you bottle your Vaux under Fourchaume or your Séché as Vaillant, do you feel that they give a sense of Vaillant and Fourchaume, or do they feel like very specifically different things?
So, uh, of course, you will feel that they are part of the same family. For example, the Vaux is part of the Fourchaume family. It can reveal some characteristics that are typical of Fourchaume, which will be this the overall richness and generosity of the terroir. But if you go more specifically, Vaux will have its own characteristic. Vaux is a very interesting example because Vaux, even if it's part of the Fourchaume area, what's interesting to see is that it's a bit disconnected from the rest of the Fourchaume. Actually, there is a small valley that separates, and the vineyard of Fourchaume stops. There is a small valley, and then after that, you can have another hill of Premier Cru that belongs to Fourchaume, but that is geographically actually closer to the Grand Cru Lépreuse. And also, Fourchaume is a very long area. It's more than 2 kilometers long. So you can imagine that the wine that are produced at the north of the hill of the valley, facing southwest, will have a different expression than the wines that are produced in this small valley of Fourchaume with a south exposure and a different soil. So that's part of all this diversity. And that's why also at the domain, we prefer to name our Vaux Premier Cru Vaux, which is the original exact name of the location or where is the plot, rather than give him a more generic name. Because what we want to do at the domain is really to make terroir-driven wines and respect the original and authentic terroir expression from where the grapes come from. And that's the same for Séché on the left bank. The Vaillant Valley is quite a big valley with a lot of diversity. So we have a plot in the heart of Vaillant that is called Vaillant, actually. So that we label on the name of Vaillant. So Vaillant, the characteristic of Vaillant is that ripe fruit, fleshy, generous fruit, kind of a tropical stone, wide flesh fruit characteristic that you can find in the Séché, but in the Séché, the soil is also different with a bit more of limestone and fossils than in the other part of the Vaillant that is a bit richer in clay. So that makes this distinction to the Séché that will give this more precision and finesse in the wine. So that's also the reason why we prefer to separate the Séché plot and vinify it separately. That was not the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we used to blend everything and make one cuvée of Vaillant, but we realized that it was very interesting to show that difference of terroir.
Yes, and you really do. I mean, I love that Séché wine, and it is, as you say, it's quite different. Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. And I suppose to summarize what you've just said, the consolidation of the Premier Cru is helpful. And in the way that we perhaps conceive of them, there's a family resemblance, obviously, from the groupings that you have. But of course, because Chablis is so diverse, you can still dig into that more specific detail as you do in Séché and Vaux.
Yeah, totally.
And the consolidation, from your point of view, makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
i.e. the mapping has been done well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, in a similar vein, I just wondered if I could ask you specifically about your Vaux Désir vines and what you think is special about the Vaux Désir site.
So Vaux Désir is a very interesting Grand Cru because the characteristic of the topology of the area is quite unique because Vaux Désir, it's a small valley, which is just behind the Grenouille. So actually the valley of Vaux Désir is protected from the hill of Grenouille on the south part. And then on the north part, there is another hill going up. At the end, it's a kind of a small valley that can be really hot in the summer. It's a kind of a heat trap in this area. It can be also very cold during the spring because it can be a very frosty place. And I think that to me, Vaux Désir is one of the most interesting Grand Cru because there is a huge diversity in all Vaux Désir sites. You have a lot of different type of soil, even within this small area. From the entrance of the valley till the end of the valley, it's totally different soil. And also very important, in Vaud d'Isère, you have two slopes. The majority of the site is on the south-facing part, and there is a small part of Vaud d'Isère which is on the north-facing part. So what's very interesting first to see is that you can have a Grand Cru facing north. That's the case in Vaud d'Isère. And it makes two totally different wine, because you can imagine that the south-facing part of Vaud d'Isère, in a very warm environment, can produce wine that will be very powerful, and where the winemakers has to be very careful to avoid overripe characteristic. And on the north-facing part is the opposite, because it's protected from the warm, and so the ripening is much slower and very healthy condition. So you pick up two different style of grapes. As far as we are concerned at the domain, we are on the north-facing part, and that's very interesting because it helps a lot to keep the freshness in the wines. When we harvest our plot of Vaud d'Isère, very often, my friend that have vineyards on the opposite part, on the south-facing part, they harvest their plot maybe 1 week before we do, which is a lot, in the so small area. But the style of our wines in Vaud d'Isère will keep much more of freshness and a bit higher acidity. And given the characteristic of the weather now that is totally changing, I think that that part of Vaud d'Isère is definitely the future. It helps a lot in that condition. And the style of Vaud d'Isère, it's a wine on the three Grand Cru that we are lucky to have. I would say that the Vaud d'Isère will be the wine that will be the most generous and showing, especially when young. While the two other, the Grenouille and l'Éclos, they need more time to develop. When they're young, they can still remain a bit austere and compact. The Vaud d'Isère is always the wine that shows the most aromatic characteristic, even when young. So it doesn't mean that it's wine that won't age. It will age beautifully, but it's definitely a wine that you can enjoy first, while the two other Grand Cru can wait a little bit in your cellar.
Excellent. And before we move on from looking at specific terroir, I want to just talk briefly about Monte de Tonnerre, because you said that there's not a different qualitative rating to Premier Cru, it's more character. But of course, Monte de Tonnerre does enjoy a very high reputation, a very specific reputation, and it's an important piece of land for you. How do you characterize that particular plot?
We are approaching the quality of the Grand Cru. Now, geographically, Monte de Tonnerre is not very far from the Grand Cru, just as well as Vaux-Laurent. So exposure is different to the other Premier Cru that we have, especially on the left bank, because we are talking about a southwest exposure, so it's like more morning sun. The hill is well protected from the winds from the east, so it's a warmer area. So you have more ripeness, and the soil is pure Khmer region soil, of course, in that part of the appellation. And also on our plot is very interesting because our plot of Monte de Tonnerre, we have quite a big parcel that starts from the bottom to the top of the almost the top of the hill, and it's very homogeneous. The soil is very homogeneous, so it produces a wine that is very homogeneous. We have differences of ripeness. It's riper at the top of the hill rather than at the bottom, so you can have differences in terms of harvest. We do not harvest all the Monte de Tonnerre the same day. Sometimes we need to wait a little bit because the upper part of the hill will be riper than the lower part. But it produces a wine that is rich, complex, powerful, generous, and with this typical also flinty, gunflint characteristic. So it's a complete wine. It's a full wine. You have everything. Sometimes it needs a bit more time because when young, it can be a bit compact and a little bit austere, even on hot vintages. For example, compared to the Vaud d'Isère that we were talking earlier, Monte de Tonnerre sometimes needs more time to express everything. But to me, it's definitely one of the best example of what Chablis can produce. Chablis terroir can produce a typical wine of Chablis.
Okay, well, now's a good time to talk about what that typical style is. From Australia, where there were wines called Chablis, lots of them not necessarily even made from Chardonnay, but then there were Chardonnay wines that called themselves Chablis style. Over time, that idea of a Chablis style has been obviously so strong to have those associations. What would you say the Chablis style is in people's minds traditionally, maybe from 30 years ago, and what is the Chablis style now?
Well, in people's minds, Chablis means purity, Chardonnay, of course. I just realized that we didn't pronounce the word Chardonnay since we started this conversation. But of course, we should remember that Chablis is made only with Chardonnay. Image of Chablis can be, yes, this purity. Also, it can be austerity sometimes, when it's quite young. So it's image of Chablis. It doesn't mean that it's true. Huh? Image of Chablis can mean early drinking wine, especially with the Petit Chablis entry-level wine, but that's not the case for the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru that can age 10, 20 years. Sometimes people would say the strength of Chablis is that it's very easily recognizable because of this terroir characteristic that we talked a bit earlier, which is very unique, this Kimmeridgian soil combined with continental climate in the northernmost parts of Burgundy. And yes, and also because of that success, yes, as you said, Chablis became kind of a category name, especially in English-speaking markets. Because of his success, I think Chablis name was misused for a long time to define generic dry wines. But that's the problem when you make a wine that is very clearly and easy to identify. But the reality is that Chablis is unique. There is, I think, no other appellation in the world that can have this combination of climate, Kimmeridgian, and Chardonnay. Chablis is, to me, clearly one of the great terroir wines in Burgundy, especially when you think about the Grand Cru that we produce in Chablis. And also in the winemaking, if you have different trends, we can talk about the use of oak, not the use of oak. That shows also the diversity and the richness of Chablis because you have really different trends of winemaking that will have a clearly very important impact on the style of the wine and the diversity of the wine of Chablis.
Yeah, another stereotype I suppose that comes up sometimes in, say, a textbook is of Chablis being high in acid, and perhaps if people talk about flavour descriptors, very typically they talk about green apple and lemon. Now, I don't feel it's very helpful to talk in terms of those descriptors in any case, but when it comes to the idea of growing Chablis now, when you're talking about picking your grapes at perfect ripeness, obviously we're not talking about a high acid, mean, green apple wine. We're talking about something with juicy, balanced acidity, so it's not acidic. And potentially those fruit characters are much more diverse, but also there is more to the flavour than stereotypical, not very ripe fruit. A Chablis that has been picked at good ripeness and vinified with good judgment, how does that wine taste and how does it feel?
You have this austerity, the minerality. So I don't like to, it's difficult to use that word minerality because I don't know exactly what it means. Everyone has his own definition of minerality. But what's interesting that when you pick quite at a good ripeness, you will have a lot of more fruity diversity, complexity characteristic in the wine. A wine of Chablis that is picked up a bit too early will be more focused on this austerity and green lemon apple characteristic that you were talking about. And that was the case, back in the 70s when they used to make wine in Chablis by working with unripe grapes. They used to harvest not perfectly ripe grapes in October because that was the style of the wine and that was because of the growing season at this time. So they used to produce that kind of wine that could have this very bit austere acidity and maybe lack of aromatic complexity, especially when the wine were young. And that's why at this time we need to wait a lot for the wines in the bottle to develop and for the terroir to rise. Now that's not the case anymore because of the nice ripeness that we have. We produce wine that even when they are young are already showing this generosity and this complexity of aromas. And this is because of the ripeness of the grapes, I'm part of the lucky generation because my generation in Chablis, we make wine with ripe grapes, which was not the case. My grandfather, he did maybe 60 harvests and maybe none of them was perfectly ripe. So he was able to make good wine, but different styles. Wine that you need to forget in the cellar, wine that need age before tasting well. That's not the case anymore. the wine of Chablis now are showing their best even when young.
Yeah, as you say, minerality is a strange word because no one's really defined it very well. But you talked about the flintiness that you get in some of those wines. And I suppose, in a sense, a streak of something quite firm, but at the same time, juiciness to the fruit at the same time as acidity. So you've got quite different structural elements going in there to find that balance in Chablis these days.
Yeah, definitely. I think Chablis is getting more and more interesting for all that reason, yes. And I think also that the diversity of terroir will express even more. You're talking about Vaudésir, for example. Vaudésir produces today totally different wines that plot used to produce, especially on the north-facing part of the Vaudésir, that used to produce 30 years ago. So it's totally changing, yeah, definitely. But in a good way. That the good news is that so far, Chablis to me, still has his very strong identity. Despite the climate change, the identity of Chablis is still here.
Yeah. And in terms of changes, what are the current trends, both from a growing point of view and from a market point of view, that you see at the moment being a grower in Chablis?
I think that Chablis, on the market, Chablis has a lot of success. We are quite lucky, probably because the consumer, when they open a bottle of Chablis, they know that they won't have a bad surprise. They will clearly recognize the wine that they taste after purchasing a bottle. So that's very important. There is no bad surprises. In terms of trends, you mean in the winemaking process, for example?
Yeah, maybe in the winemaking and also in the farming.
So trends in the farming, we are more and more organic growers. I think there is people realize that growing organic is more and more important today, even if in Chablis it's quite tricky because of the mildew pressure that is very high in this area, because we are quite north, especially compared to my colleagues that are in the south of the country. We have no mildew pressure. So growing organic is quite tricky in Chablis, can be very, very difficult. But I think that people realize that it's quite important, especially if you want to preserve the original terroir expression. And in terms of winemaking, it's interesting because there are always been two trends in Chablis in terms of winemaking. The use of oak barrel and the use of tank. So my grandfather was one of the first in Chablis to completely quit with using oak barrels.
In which year?
I was 55 years ago. I think the last vintage with oak was 68 or 69. Quite a long time. So at this time, he was one of the first, and he was the first to stop using oak barrel for all the wines of the production, from the Petit Chablis to the Grand Cru. So you have these two trends, using oak or not using oak. So at the Domaine Michel, we are clearly in the stainless steel tank trend, because for us, it's the best way to preserve the freshness, the minerality, the tension in the wine, and also to make wine, I would say, authentic terroir expression without any winemaking techniques that will go against the natural expression of the terroir. But what's interesting to see today is that there are quite a lot of producers that decided to also move to produce wine in tank. But for a lot of them, they will use the tank more on the Petit Chablis and the Chablis. And when dealing with the Premier Cru or Grand Cru, they will have a different winemaking process, working with a little bit of oak barrels and making something a bit different. So meaning different winemaking process depending on the origin of the grapes, the terroir. At the Domaine, our philosophy is totally different. We want to let the terroir talk. So for that reason, all the wines of our range, from the Petit Chablis to the Grand Cru, will have exactly the same vinification without any kind of discrimination between the Grand Cru and the Petit Chablis. It's the same vinification in the winery. So the idea is really to focus on all those terroir differences and terroir expression by having, I would say, a winemaking influence on the wine that will be as small as possible.
And when it comes to oak, here in Australia, there has been a move away from new oak and more people using larger format oak. So for Chardonnay, larger barrels and a higher proportion of used barrels, or a smaller proportion of new barrels. Would that be a similar thing in Chablis?
Yeah, some people do that. which I think it's a good step leading to making wine in tank only. And also it's great because you can now taste and wine in Chablis that were mature in oak, but that don't have this oaky, this caricature of oaky style of wine, which is very important and very interesting as well. But once again, in a range, the wine that are made using oak barrel, small or big ones, will have a different expression and will have more winemaking influence on the terroir rather than wines that are made only in tank.
Yeah, I mean, is there a sense with Chablis, given the profile of the wines, as you said, they are typically very pure and precise. Do you feel that, like with, I don't know, with Riesling, that a little bit of something makes a big difference in Chablis when it comes to masking flavour? So when it comes to lees or batonnage, oak, that a little bit tends to speak a little bit louder?
It makes a huge difference because, Chablis wines, naturally, Chablis wines are very, pure and delicate wines. So when you have a winemaking process that can have an influence on the wines, you can feel it very quickly in the wines of Chablis because it won't be masked by any kind of very strong aromatic characteristic or so on. You were talking about Riesling, for example. Chardonnay is very delicate and fine. So the very small winemaking process can have a huge consequence on the style of the wine.
Yes. Now, we were talking before we came on air about the frost. Obviously, you had last week a very sleepless set of nights because of the frost. Tell us a little bit about how you are dealing with frost in Chablis.
So during all the springtime, it's everyday threat, and we have to be ready for that. So you have different kind of frost protection that we use. Historically, of course, we use smudge pots or candles that are widely used to protect vineyards, and not only vineyards, actually, to protect every plant. And so the idea is to light big candles in the vineyard when it's going in a dangerous temperature. To give you an idea, to protect 1 hectare of vineyards with those candles, you need to put 400 of them per hectare. It's quite dense. And one candle will protect your vineyards for about, let's say, on average, 8 hours. So first, there is a risk because if you have a night where at, let's say, midnight, it's already 0 degrees, and assuming that the coldest time of the night will be at the sunrise, if you light your candles at midnight, you have the risk that when it will be the sunrise, your candle is off and won't protect at the most dangerous part of the day. So what we do to fight against that is that we don't put 400, but 800 per hectare. And we light a first one and we get ready to light a second one if necessary to protect. So it's a lot of candles. It's a lot of work. You need people to light the candle. You need people to turn off the candle after when you don't use it at all. So it's a lot of human resources, and also it's quite a lot of investment because one candle is about between 10 and 12 euro per candle. So quite a lot.
Yes.
And of course, technically, you can imagine that you cannot protect 25 hectares of vineyards by doing that. So at the domain, we protect a bit less than 2 hectares of vineyards with dot candles. The vineyards that we protect are known to be frosty areas because, with time, we know which are the ones that will get more frost. So basically, it's the Grand Cru, it's the Voloran site. And as well as today, we decided to put some in the lower part of Montmain hill because it's quite a cold area. Other way of protection is electric wires. So it's totally different. The idea is to install electric wires in every row. And when we bend the cane, the birds are very next to that electric wires. And with the electricity, it's a kind of a resistance. It will, when we start the electricity, it will create some heat around that wire that will protect the bird from frost. It's very efficient. The good thing is that we don't need to light any candles or anything. We just need to push a button. Also, we can set it up to automatic, so you can turn it out automatically while the temperature drops to a certain level. It's very interesting. To me, it's something that is developing a lot. We did install almost 2 hectares of electric wires in the Monte Tonnerre area, all the bottom of the Monte Tonnerre, which is widely protected by that, because before that, we used to protect Monte Tonnerre using candles, so we don't have to do that anymore, thanks to that. It's quite costly as well, but once you install it, you have it for at least 20 years. So that's why for me, it's the future. Plus, it's more green than burning candles, as you can imagine. And another way of protection is using big fans that creates movement of air. And by moving the air, you can raise a little bit the temperature. But that, to be efficient, you need to do it on a very wide area, large area. So you need a lot of people to do it in common. And also, if you have too much hills and valleys, it won't be very efficient. It's more efficient on a more like a flat area. So we don't have that kind of protection because our parcels are not in some areas that in which it could be efficient. And another way of protection is spraying water. So by spraying water, the birds are in the water, and because it's cold, the water will turn into ice. And so by doing that, it will liberate calories that will protect the birds and remaining at 0 degrees. But to be efficient, you need to continuously spray water, because if you stop spraying water and that it's cold, then after that, the calorie will go and it will be pure ice and it will freeze. So to be efficient, you need to continuously spray water until there is no more ice. So you need a lot of water, as you can imagine. It's a huge installation, pumping water in the river and spraying in the vineyard. So, and here again, winemakers that do that set up a common installation that protects big parts of the appellation, and it's quite efficient actually. But the negative way is that by spraying a lot of water, you add more humidity. Humidity increases the risk of frost, and also if you have a lot of nights of frost, like it was in 21 vintage, for example, when we had maybe 7 or 8 nights in a row of frost, you can imagine that at the end, the amount of water spray in the vineyard is quite significant. You can almost consider it as a kind of heavy rain. So it can change also the soil, and it can change also a little bit the future of the growing season in the vineyards.
Yeah, right. And I assume that because of climate change, you're getting some warmer starts to the season, warmer end of winter, warmer start to spring with earlier bud burst, putting the vines at risk for a larger window?
Exactly. You could think that it's not logical, but with global warming, there are much more spring frost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hard work. So just tell me now, let's focus on your family itself. You have quite a long dynasty of growing grapes, both on your grandmother and grandfather's side.
Yeah. That's so I'm part of an old family in Chablis. My family did start making wine in Chablis in 1850. Before that, they were making wine in Tonnerre, which is another area not far from here, 15 kilometers from here. But it all started in Chablis in 1850. So quite an old family. I'm the sixth generation of winemaker, and Louis Michel was actually my grandfather.
Right. And how has the domain grown over time?
So the size of the domain today is 25 hectares, and it's been like that for the last 60 years. 60, 70 years. It's with my grandfather that it all started. It set up the domain as it is today, because at this time it was still possible to purchase some land, to expand. There was still quite a lot of transaction. It was moving. Chablis was not in a very good, back in the 50s, condition of Chablis were quite tricky, not totally different as it is today, mainly also because of the spring frost that was already an issue at this time of the year. But the expansion of Chablis all started back in the 60s, 70s. Yeah, the domain is like that since that time.
Okay, so as you said, you're growing Chardonnay. In one area of France, you are using stainless steel tanks and keeping everything as simple as possible. So, what is your work?
Me?
Yeah. How do you deploy your personnel? What is your focus in terms of growing the best grapes you can for making the best wine you can?
You need to focus in the vineyards. You make your wine in the vineyard, especially if you want to make terroir-driven wines, which we want to do. So the majority of my people work in the vineyards all year long. There is always something to do in the vineyard. And also the fact that we have decided our philosophy, is to produce clean, fresh, precise wine. And so to do that, we work only in stainless steel tank. We don't use oak barrels at all. So I have to admit that the work in the winery is quite, I would have said easy. It's not easy, of course, because you work with nature, so you have to be very careful being all time here. In terms of work, I don't have as much work to do in the winery as my friends that are working with oak barrels, for instance, working with small container. For us, it's much easier. And also because the minimum I do in the winery, the happier I am, because I want the wine to mature naturally. It gives me much more time to focus on the vineyards, actually. So that's how we organize.
Yeah. So how big is the team and what are their roles?
So total 10 people. 7 of them are only in the vineyards from 1st of January till 31st of December working in the vineyards. Then there is me with my CellarHand is working with me in the winery. He's preparing orders for Australia or everywhere else. The work on the wines in the winery is done exclusively by me and my CellarHand. Altogether, just 2 people. That's enough.
And what is the rough breakdown of production, or even vineyard area, I suppose, between Petit Chablis, Chablis, the Premier Cru, and the Grand Cru at Louis Michel?
So 25 hectares. The characteristic of our domain is that the majority of our production is located in Premier and Grand Cru. So it's the opposite of the global Chablis, because global Chablis, Premier Cru and Grand Cru represent maybe 15% of the production. For us, Premier and Grand Cru represent 70% of the production. We are lucky as an old family to have all our vineyards located in the historical part of Chablis, just around the village of Chablis. The farthest vineyard is Buteau, which is located maybe 2.5 kilometers from the village, which is just nothing. And the closest one are the Grand Cru that are just localized 900 meters from here, from the village. We are lucky to have 8 different Premier Cru located on both sides, from left bank and right bank. We are lucky to have 3 different Grand Cru, 1 Chablis, 1 Petit Chablis, so that makes quite a wide range. And our philosophy is really to vinify everything exactly the same, focusing in the vineyards. Then once harvest is done, if you did a good job in the vineyard, when you harvest, you've done 90% of the job. Then after that, it's just a question of checking, controlling. We manipulate the wine as minimum as possible. We let the fermentation start spontaneously, because I think that working with native yeast is much more interesting than working with selected yeast that use uniform a little bit the aromatic characteristic of the wines. The malolactic fermentation is also done spontaneously in Chablis, and we do not stop it. We let the wine do their malo. I know that some people are thinking about controlling the malo or stopping the malo to keep acidity, because the characteristic of malolactic is that the acidity is going down. But we don't do that, because I think it will be a mistake, because aromatically, by doing that, you will lose quite a lot of characteristic in your wines. So actually, the fermentation process is quite long, because working with natural yeast is much longer than with selected yeast. So the fermentation process, both alcoholic and malolactic, is about 2 to 3 months long, quite long, during which the wine is gently bubbling. And then after that, we rack the wine by keeping fine lees or no, depending on the vintage. If the vintage is already very ripe and fleshy, I will not try to mature the wine using too much lees, because I don't want the wines to be too flabby and too heavy. And also, I consider that after 3 months of fermentation, the lees contact is enough in most of the case. And then after that, we just rack the wine and mature the wine in tank, big container, for 8 to 10 months for Petit Chablis and Chablis, and up to 18, 20 months for the Grand Cru. So you see, just one rough filtration before the bottling. That's all. I try to avoid doing any fining or doing anything. In some vintages, we have to do some fining with using bentonite, which is a totally neutral kind of clay, but it's not systematical. We had to do the fining on 23 vintage because it was a vintage that was very rich in terms of proteins, so it was a bit too risky not to find the wines. It helps us to avoid having kind of blurring wines in the bottle, especially if the storage is not a very good condition, if it's a bit too warm, for example. So we had to do the finding on 23 vintage, but 24, no, we didn't have to because naturally the protein was quite low. And so you see, it's mainly focusing in the vineyards. And in the vineyards, there is nothing that is systematical because, you know, you work with Mother Nature and it's Mother Nature that decided what you have to do. So, for example, right now we are starting to bend the canes because it did grow quite a lot. So we start to bend the canes, but I told them, don't do it too quickly. Take your time because once a cane has been bent to start the, you know, the growing, it becomes more sensitive to frost.
Right.
So we do it, but gently on upper hills where the risk of frost is lower, but very slowly.
Yes. So organic wine growing in an area that has mildew risk and very changeable weather. So those 7 people in the vineyard year round focus on healthy fruit, balanced yields, ripeness, and then what do we get when a consumer picks up a bottle of Louis Michel Chablis? What do you hope that they are going to feel and taste when they look at your wines?
I hope they're going to feel freshness, authenticity. If they open several bottles coming from several places, I hope they're going to feel those differences of terroir that are very interesting and that are huge in Chablis. And even talking about 2 different plots that are just separated for 300 meters. For example, between the plot of Montmain and the plot of Forêt, for example, you have 300 meters. But the wines are so different because because the soil is different. Montmain is much richer in clay than Forêt. So on a cool climate soil, so it will make a wine that is very floral with typical saline iodine characteristic, while the Forêt is more on a limestone, more Kimmeridgian, more solid limestone clay. So you will have much more tension and spice and gunflint flinty characteristic. So, you know, coming from 2 places that are just 200 meters away with 2 same age vineyards, because overall on the domain, the average of vineyards is 50 years old and makes 2 totally different style of wine. So that's what I want when some people open a bottle of Chablis. I want them to be able to see that Chablis is a wine that is fine, precise, and linear, but with a lot of different expression and different variation of this minerality and this finesse.
Yeah, I mean, something that really struck me when I came to see you, that was 2018, I think, was that we don't actually have the pleasure that often of tasting a lineup of Chablis from one grower. And I think there's a tendency from a consumer point of view, and it's totally understandable, not just from a consumer point of view, but maybe even from a trade point of view, that they know a producer's wine from tasting one wine from their lineup when it comes to Chablis, and make quite a lot of assumptions about what that grower is like from one wine. Whereas I think there's such a big argument for the pleasure, but also the mental exercise of tasting a lineup of, say, Premier Cru Chablis from Louis Michel.
Definitely, yeah.
Obviously, it's a luxury in terms of what you drink, but I feel that's the only way of really knowing where the producer is and where the land is in those wines, because they are, as you say, very different.
Yeah, I totally agree, especially when the producer, like me, try to put the less influence as possible on the wines. I try to make the textbook Chablis, I would say. I don't want people to taste the style of my vinification. I don't want that. That's not interesting. I want people to taste the style of Chablis.
Yeah, and therefore it's kind of totally all right if someone says that they much prefer Vaillant to Montmain in your range.
That's
it's like,
it.
Well, they're
Yeah.
supposed to be different
That's
wines,
logical.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, last question, really. Obviously, we've talked a lot here about how Chablis is an exciting wine, a vintage-specific terroir wine, so something with lots of potential to engage both your senses and your mind when you taste it. It's obviously not an easy place to grow grapes in many ways. You know, nothing's easy in wine these days, but talking about your sleepless nights fighting frosts, but also just the general challenges of wine growing. What is it that gives you joy and satisfaction about being a wine grower in Chablis?
The fact that every vintage is different. So that's very important because I hate monotony. The fact that every vintage is different. The fact that every day Mother Nature signature will have a surprise for us. So it can be stressful, but it's also very exciting. It's changing, it's moving. Plus, we are living now in a time when it's moving quite a lot. With all that climate change and the global warming, we have more and more challenges. So that's quite exciting, actually. Yeah.
And what about leading a team? Do you enjoy being the person who has other people working really hard on something, as you say, shepherding or working with Mother Nature to produce something? Does it feel like a really good challenge to rise to and a really good sense of achievement when you and your team manages to come out with a vintage and say, well, we're really proud of these wines?
Of course. No, it's great. It's great to work all together. We are all together to make the wine. It's a teamwork because myself, I can't do anything. We need people. We need team. It's also great because I'm very lucky to have a team that is very loyal and faithful. They stay here. I can rely on them without any problem. When I call them at 2 a.m. Because it's frosty, they are all here. They come and without any discussion. That's great. And that's very important. It was great that you asked this question because we don't talk a lot about all the team and all the people working in the vineyards, but we are lucky to have quite a lot of people on which we can count to help us. And that's their passion. They love it. They love to be in the vineyards. If one day I ask them, I will need you in the cellar for 3 days because we need people to help, I don't know, bottling, or we have a huge order to prepare for CellarHand. We don't have too much time. We need help. They will come, but they will be like, I don't want to be in the cellar. I prefer to be outside. You can see that because it happens sometimes. You need when you have a rush in the cellar for 1 or 2 days, we need the help of 1 or 2 people. They come but you can feel that. When looking at them, you can feel that they are not in their place. They just want one thing, is that we finish that and go back to the vineyards.
Well, I hope you give them a nice drink then.
Yeah, sure, always. And having a Monte de Tonnerre glass with a big Comté cheese at 6 a.m. after spending the night in the vineyards, that's really great. Yeah, that's a good treat for the team. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it for this week's edition of Vininspo Alternative Format. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make your feelings known loud and clear on the social media and podcast platforms where you came across it. Huge thanks again to my guest, Guillaume Michel, and to his Aussie importer, CellarHand, for allowing this to happen. Subscribe to Vininspo to have next week's podcast with trailblazing Iberian wine importer Scott Wasley of the Spanish Acquisition land directly in your inbox. But for now, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.